Hello, this is a daily report for Friday, March 25th. There has been a further decline in Korea's daily tally today, but authorities remain wary amid the growing presence of stealth Omicron on the local front. We have details later on. Here first is the general pandemic coverage. I have Kwon-So standing by. So as always, just start us off then.
Sunny, as you said, we are continuing our downward streak in daily COVID-19 infections. As of 12 a.m. this Friday, Korea has tallied a little under 340,000 new COVID-19 infections, with most of these being domestic transmissions. Now, that is a drop by around 56,000 from the day before. And also, if you compare the figure to last Friday, it marks quite a downward trend when we had, compared to last Friday, when we had over 400,000 infections. And going over to our map, there is a mix of 4-digit and 5-digit figures this Friday, but Gyeonggi province has dropped to below the 100,000 mark in new COVID-19 infections. And let's also take a look at the number of fatalities. 393 people have lost their lives in the span of 24 hours, or the number of new reported deaths in the past day stands at 393. And the total number of cases in Korea now stands at above 11.1 million. And the number of patients remaining in severe or critical condition has been standing at above 1,004 weeks now. And now, as you can see, not a big change from the day before. Onto our vaccination figures, a slight rise here in the number of fully vaccinated people, which now stands at 86.7%. But we only have less than 2,000 daily vaccinations when it comes to the first and second shot. But in the past day, we've got over 40,000 people who have been administered with a booster shot. Let's take a look at the global figures. Around 1.7 million new infections were reported in the past day, with a little less than 5,400 COVID-19 related deaths. And Germany, meanwhile, has hit a record high of over 300,000 cases in the past day. And as of noon Korea time, again, more than 300,000 infections were posted there. Vietnam also a 6-digit figure, while the UK has dropped slightly to the 5-digit figure of new infections. And those are the general updates I have for now, but I'll see you back in a bit. Sunny?
All right, so thank you for those tallies, and do get yourself seated for more domestic coverage, which will begin with my colleague Shin Ye-eun. Yeon, welcome back.
Glad to be here, Sunny.
Right, so I hear authorities are bracing themselves for greater record highs, that is, in COVID-19 fatalities in the weeks ahead. Let's start with this, Yeon.
Sure. So just yesterday, which would be a Thursday, we saw the highest number of deaths in a 24-hour span at 470. On this Friday, the tally fell by roughly 80, but still marked the third highest figure at 393. We have to also keep in mind that COVID-19 deaths are a lagging indicator of infections, and that our daily tallies hovered in the 200,000s in the first week of March. Recently, the figures have stayed above 300 or 400,000, and we also saw a record number of infections last week at over 620,000. This may indicate that Korea could see double the number of deaths in the coming weeks compared to now, with over 1,000 daily deaths. And some experts have also suggested that our actual death toll from COVID-19 could actually be 2 or 3 times more than the government's official tally. Now, this could be owed to a number of factors, like COVID-19 patients who die from health complications after testing negative for the virus and being released from quarantine. But the government has maintained that Korea has a low fatality rate at 0.13%. Authorities insist that its official death count is accurate and includes fatalities resulting from underlying health conditions. But at the end of the day, both health authorities and experts say those at high risk need to be treated effectively.
Meanwhile, Yeon, the Prime Minister here believes Korea is past the worst of the Omicron wave.
That's right, Sunny. Earlier this morning, Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum said Korea's Omicron surge appears to have been tamed to a certain degree. Take a listen to what he said.
Compared to last week, we're seeing 50,000 fewer infections each day on average. Though we still need to see whether this downward trend will continue, I think we can say that we're getting over the hardest part.
The Prime Minister cautioned, though, that more efforts are needed to reduce the number of deaths and severely ill patients. As part of that goal, he shared the government's plan to distribute more antiviral pills. For weeks now, our supplies of antiviral pills have been running low as some 7,000 courses of Paxlovid are being given out each day. In response, authorities have decided to take delivery of Paxlovid shipments contracted for April earlier than planned. Today, we saw some 44,000 courses of Paxlovid arrive in the country. Officials are also in the final stage of securing more deals, and also a new oral pill, Lagevrio, is to be given out from Saturday, some 100,000 courses of them, in fact. And this pill, made by Merck, is the second one of its kind to receive the green light from the country's drug regulator. They will be used on seniors age 60 and up, or those age 40 and up with underlying conditions, and the immunocompromised at high risk of drug-to-drug interaction related to Paxlovid. But pregnant women and children under 18 will not be eligible.
Moving on to the inoculation front here, registration for those aged 5 to 11 started on Thursday. Vaccine registrations, of course. How are parents responding?
Well, the majority of parents don't want their children vaccinated, at least not at this time. Health authorities conducted a survey on some 359,000 parents with children in an elementary school to ask whether they were willing to vaccinate their child, and 6 out of 10 said no. Most parents said they wanted to test the waters and wait for more related studies on vaccination for young children, and experts said this type of information should be disclosed transparently. Actual vaccinations for this age group, meanwhile, are set to kick off on March 31st.
Right, I see. And staying with vaccinations, so a new study from the UK suggests that booster shots are quite effective for the elderly.
Right, more widely recommended than for children, of course, is the vaccination campaign for the elderly, with booster shots having become the norm domestically and abroad. Now, fresh data from the UK's Health Security Agency on Thursday showed an effectiveness against hospitalization among people aged 65 and above by 85%, 15 weeks, so almost 4 months after receiving an extra dose of COVID-19 vaccine. 2 weeks after their third one, efficacy was estimated at 91%. The study is based on calculations of people who were hospitalized primarily due to respiratory problems and tries to distinguish between people who were admitted to hospitals due to COVID-19 and those who had an illness and tested positive for the virus in routine checkups. It's the first such data released in the UK on the longer-term prevention of boosters. The country is using Pfizer and Moderna vaccines for its booster campaign.
And speaking of the elderly, experts have also called on nursing homes to better exercise management and prevention, as 1/3 of our deaths have come from these venues. To aid their efforts, authorities said they will prescribe more antiviral pills and put more effort into treating COVID-19 patients with underlying conditions. Authorities believe that this particular group is at very high risk, who require constant care and monitoring to treat chronic illnesses rather than just COVID. On the testing front, authorities have been discussing whether to stop handing out rapid antigen tests at screening centers nationwide. Most regional governments are supporting this move in hopes that medical staff working at these screening centers can be reassigned to focus on treating patients instead. Now, if discussions go as planned, this change could take effect from April 4th. Now, this is also when the country is widely expected to further ease social distancing restrictions.
All right, Yael, thank you. Let's turn to Soa now, who has details from the latest government briefing on Korea's Omicron situation. Soa.
Right, let's start with what appears to be a downward trend of the Omicron situation, as Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum also suggested at the earlier government meeting. And at the following briefing, Health Minister Lee Ki-il referred to the decline in cases compared to a week ago, saying from the roughly 405,000 weekly average in daily cases to around 358,000 as of this Friday, Korea observed a drop by around 12%. He also expressed hopes for the more than 620,000 cases the nation posted last Thursday to be the last record in this pandemic in terms of daily caseload. The number of patients in severe or critical conditions standing at around 1,000 to 1,100, as well as roughly 340 deaths a day in the past week, may continue to rise, though. So risk factors remain, and the following statement seems to be the general view of the government, that is sticking to.
I
can tell you that we're closely monitoring the emergence of the BA2 stealth Omicron variant and its potential impact on the country. At the same time, there are enough indications to suggest that our outbreak is trending downwards.
Meanwhile, with regard to Korea's COVID-19 fatalities, the government officials continue to reiterate that our death toll remains low compared to that of the counterparts there.
Right. This actually has been mentioned by Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum also earlier, which seemed to be a counter remark towards criticisms on Korea's latest COVID-19 response, saying COVID-19 has claimed significantly fewer lives compared to others. Official Lee Gi-il cited data from the World Health Organization, which shows the number of fatalities per 100,000 people of key countries. As of March 21st, this figure stood at almost 290 in the US, 261 in Italy, close to 240 in the UK, 211 in France, and 151 in Germany. Here in South Korea, 24.7 people out of 100,000 COVID-19 patients have lost their lives. He also made a comparison in the death rates in percentage terms.
Korea's figure is currently at 0.13%. In comparison, the rate stands at 1.2% in the US, 1.14% in Italy, and 0.81% in the UK. In Germany, the rate is seen at 0.68%, and in France, it's 0.59%. Roughly speaking, Korea's fatality rate is 1/10 that of other countries.
Right, but regardless of that reality, infections among high-risk groups continue to rise, right?
Unfortunately, yes. And also, Yin touched upon this earlier a bit. The rise among residents at nursing facilities falling ill to the coronavirus. And that itself is not the only problem. Authorities acknowledged that the situation at nursing hospitals and nursing homes is difficult, with infections rising, and mounting a response has been a bigger struggle for medical staff, especially as they are too getting infected. Now, while the government has provided guidelines as part of its Business Continuity Plan, or BCP, that shorten the quarantine period for medical staff who get infected, in many cases, the lack of staff remains a problem. That's why the government vowed to do more in dispatching medical workers and also support them with incentives.
I see. All right, so as always, thank you very much for that coverage. Yeon, thank you for this week and have a safe weekend.
Thank you so much.
In our headlines, North Korea appears defiant and determined to develop its military capabilities following Thursday's testing of an intercontinental ballistic missile. Our North Korean affairs correspondent Kim Da-mi reports.
North Korea confirmed on Friday morning that it was successful in its test firing the previous day of a new ICBM called the Hwaseong-17. Leader Kim Jong-un himself observed the test at Sunan airfield. There, he said the regime is going to fully prepare for a long-term confrontation with the U.S. and pledged to continue strengthening its military and technical capabilities. According to the North State media, the Hwaseong-17 flew 1,090 kilometers for 67 minutes at a top altitude of 6,248 kilometers before, quote, accurately hitting the predetermined area. First unveiled at a military parade in October 2020, the Hwaseong-17 is known as the monster missile that could potentially deliver a nuclear warhead to any part of the United States. Some observers say the North has taken advantage of a certain degree of instability during South Korea's change of government and at a time when the U.S. is dealing with Russia and its war in Ukraine. But many experts say the regime is focusing more on bolstering its military and nuclear capabilities because it is fully aware that Washington will not give up on its long-held approach of dialogue and diplomacy first. Observers say the North's breaking of its self-imposed moratorium on ICBM testing was just a matter of time, considering Pyongyang has had strategic plans to do this since the 8th Party Congress in January last year.
Since the North's defense science and technology is rapidly developing, and its confidence in deploying its weapons in combat is growing, It's highly likely that the North will develop weapons that are more threatening than the Hwaseong-17.
Some analysts also say the North could escalate tensions further, trying to gain the upper hand on the Korean peninsula like it tried to do with the firing of the Hwaseong-15 in 2017. In fact, the next escalation could come rather soon with the upcoming 110th anniversary of the birth of the regime's founding leader Kim Il-sung on April 15th. In dealing with the issue going forward, South Korea's Unification Ministry on Friday pledged to work with the international community based on the close Seoul-Washington alliance and once again urged Pyongyang to immediately halt all activities that cause instability in the region. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
And as expected, the international community has condemned North Korea's latest missile testing, with the US calling it a blatant breach of related UN resolutions. Here's Kim Hyo-sun.
Washington has strongly condemned North Korea's latest ICBM test, describing it as a violation of multiple UNSC resolutions. In a statement Thursday, the White House said the regime's latest move demonstrates that it continues to prioritize its weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile programs over the well-being of its people. This came on the same day that the U.S. imposed new sanctions on individuals in North Korea, Russia, and China for violating a weapons non-proliferation regime. The State Department announced in a statement on Thursday that the North's latest move emphasizes the need to remain vigilant against countries that are proliferators of programs of concerns. President Joe Biden agreed with his Japanese counterpart Thursday to hold the North accountable for the latest launch after speaking briefly on the sidelines of the Group of 7 summit meetings in Brussels. The two also affirmed the need to resolve the escalating tensions on the Korean peninsula through diplomacy. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida also met with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson on the same day, agreeing to further intensify bilateral partnership, particularly in defense. The two also strongly condemned the North for its latest missile launch. Russia also said it's closely monitoring the situation, highlighting the need to avoid further actions that may escalate tensions in the region. Against this backdrop, the commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command says that the U.S. needs to deploy its next-generation missile defense systems on time or even earlier to keep pace with Pyongyang's growing missile capabilities. Addressing the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee on Thursday, General Glenn Van Herk, who is also the commander of U.S. Northern Command, expressed concerns about the speed of the regime's missile development. Saying that the U.S. currently has 44 ground-based interceptors deployed, he added 20 next-generation interceptors. Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the heads of diplomacy, defense and nuclear concerns on the peninsula of Seoul and Washington have held separate talks to address Pyongyang's latest display of defiance. Our Yoon Jung-min has details.
Seoul's Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong and his U.S. counterpart Antony Blinken agreed there needs to be stern responses, including additional measures by the UN Security Council. They spoke on the phone on Thursday and strongly condemned North Korea's ICBM test, saying it's a clear violation of UNSC resolutions and the regime has broken its moratorium. They also agreed to bolster the allies' close coordination while maintaining a strong joint defense posture. The same was discussed between the two countries' defense chiefs as well. On the same day, Seoul's chief nuclear envoy Do Gyu-deok and his U.S. counterpart Sung Kim also spoke on the phone and strongly condemned the recent ICBM tests. They called the launch a serious threat not just to the Korean peninsula but to the entire international community. Do and Kim urged the North to stop raising tensions immediately. Separately, Do also spoke with his Japanese counterpart Takehito Funakoshi and they too condemned the missile test. The UN Security Council is set to hold a public meeting on Friday New York time to discuss North Korea's first ICBM launch in around 4 years. 6 countries, including the U.S., have reportedly requested the meeting. Still, it remains to be seen whether it can garner support from Russia and China. Currently, the UNSC restricts the sale or transfer of all refined petroleum products to North Korea, with the allowed maximum aggregate being up to 500,000 barrels a year and limits crude oil supply to 4 million barrels. It could further tighten those restrictions following the ICBM test, but that would require at least 9 votes out of the 15 UNSC members. Also, there shouldn't be a veto by any of the 5 permanent members, which include Russia and China. It remains to be seen because there have been tensions between the U.S. and the West versus Russia and China over several geopolitical issues, including the war in Ukraine. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
And in Europe, Brussels played host to a trio of summit meetings, including those of the NATO, the G7 and the EU earlier on Thursday. The common agenda was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with US President Joe Biden calling for greater aid to the latter and stronger sanctions on the former. Our Kim Hyun-sung has more.
World leaders came together in Brussels on Thursday to discuss the urgent humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. The G7, NATO, and the EU met back-to-back. U.S. President Joe Biden, also present in Brussels, met with other leaders and decided to boost aid to Ukraine while toughening sanctions against Russia.
First was to support Ukraine with military and humanitarian assistance. Second was to impose the most significant sanctions, economic sanction regime ever, in order to cripple Putin's economy and punish him for his actions.
Billions of dollars in humanitarian aid and military equipment are on their way. Other countries in the alliance are pitching in as well. The U.S. will also accept 100,000 refugees from Ukraine. Biden also said that if Russia uses chemical warfare, the U.S. will not sit idly by to watch.
We would respond. We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use.
The G7 also warned Russia against the use of biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons in a joint statement. The UN General Assembly also met to discuss the crisis. UNICEF reports that 4.3 million children, more than half of the total in Ukraine before the war, have been driven out of their homes. Almost 3/4 of the General Assembly, 140 countries, voted to demand aid access and civilian protection in Ukraine while blaming Russia for the humanitarian crisis. The resolution was adopted Thursday with 5 votes against, including Russia, Syria, and North Korea, and 38 votes abstained, including China. Meanwhile, Ukraine and Russia exchanged prisoners of war for the first time. Ukrainian Vice Prime Minister confirmed on Thursday that under the orders of President Zelensky, the two countries swapped 10 captives each. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
In other news, as part of efforts to promote broader business ventures, KOTRA is reaching out to its foreign counterparts in this country through a monthly forum that seeks to share relevant information and provide greater opportunity. Our Min Soo-kyun was at the first forum co-hosted by KOTRA and the American Chamber of Commerce.
Under the theme 2022 Guidelines for Foreign Businesses in Korea, the first Business Plus Forum kicked off on Thursday, featuring sessions aimed at helping foreign companies, international organizations, and embassies in Korea better understand the country's latest economic and industrial trends.
In Korea, there are a lot of foreigners and foreign companies. While they have more opportunities to understand Korean culture, they don't have that much of an opportunity to get accurate information about the country's economy or industry. That's why we decided to hold the forum to provide information about Korea's economy and help people broaden their networks between other foreign chambers.
Thursday's event focused on sharing insights into South Korea's economy under the incoming Yoon Suk-yeol administration, its economic initiatives, challenges that may lie ahead, as well as potential business opportunities. The Business Plus Forum will now be held every month, with different foreign chambers taking turns to co-host the forum. Taking the wheel in April will be the Norwegian Chamber of Commerce and the British Chamber in May.
Next month's theme is going to be Korea's transition into renewable energy and what lays of business opportunities there, and also how the Korean laws, rules, and regulations kind of support this transition.
The forum follows an MOU signed between KOTRA and 18 foreign chambers of commerce in Korea, promising to cooperate and hold business sessions for fellow expats in the country. Going forward, KOTRA says it will continue to support foreign chambers of commerce by not only providing them with such lectures, but also by connecting them with relevant South Korean ministries. Min Suk-hyun, Arirang News.
As of February 24th, all remaining COVID-19 restrictions over in England were lifted, including the mandatory isolation of patients. It's been a month since then, and for a glimpse of the situation there, I have David Cox live on the line. David, it's great to have you on again.
Thank you for having me back on the show, Sunny.
Right, David, let's start with the actual COVID-19 situation there in England. Are cases on the rise or are cases on the decline there?
We have seen a particularly sharp rise again in cases in the last few weeks. So, funnily enough, in some parts of the UK, the last time COVID-19 numbers were this high was January 2021, which is before we had any vaccines available. So the latest figures suggest that around 1 in 20 people in the UK have tested positive for COVID. And I think the slightly concerning thing at the moment is that hospitalisation rates have started to creep up again in the UK. So that's the big thing which the government is keeping an eye on right now, because while there's still relatively few people in intensive care, that's the one thing we want to kind of see whether that creeps up again.
Right. And David, given the status quo then, what are the chances of a return to some COVID-19 restrictions like quarantine in the case of infection?
Well, at the moment, there's no talk of any COVID restrictions being reintroduced. So the government is determined to press on with its living with COVID policy. The widespread COVID testing is actually going to end in about a week here. So it's going to make it a lot harder to keep track of any of the cases. So the main metric is going to be the hospitals and what the situation is there. At the moment, a second booster vaccine is being rolled out to all elderly people, care home residents, and all the vulnerable. So that is the main hope, that regular vaccinations are going to be the way that we can keep this outbreak in check.
Right. And keeping in mind what you just said, how is the public responding to the absence of free testing is it April 1st then, David?
I think the picture here in the UK is quite fragmented. I think people with underlying health conditions, so people who've maybe had cancer or people who've been transplant patients, they are very concerned about this because there's going to be no way of knowing really what the real rates of COVID in the community are going to be. A number of scientists, they have pointed out that also as well, like long COVID rates are on a rise at the moment, with more and more people getting infected and no restrictions at all controlling that. That could be an ongoing problem as well. But I think that the majority of the public, I think they're just still very keen to kind of see the end of restrictions and, for things to kind of get back to normal. But it's a bit of a fragmented outlook because it depends on everyone's situation.
Right. And moving forward, David, the World Health Organization claims England as well as France and Germany have moved prematurely with regard to the scrapping that is of COVID-19 restrictions. What has been the response in England to these remarks?
I think, yes, a lot of scientists are agreeing. I mean, as I said with long COVID, a lot of scientists are pointing to the fact that that is on the rise. And at the moment, the UK's approach to COVID doesn't really take the impact of infections particularly very seriously. And some people are saying that we could end up with a generation here affected by disability, particularly through long COVID. And we don't have any treatments really for that at the moment. But then again, it's a tricky situation because, vaccine fatigue is becoming a very real phenomenon within the UK. We're moving on to the fourth range of jabs, and there's increasing numbers of people who are saying they're not going to have them, even though we know that immunity does wane after a few months. So it's a difficult situation. The scientific world is still taking COVID very seriously here, but it's the government and the public, not so much.
Right. And David, reinfection appears to be yet another challenge amid the spread of Omicron. How are authorities there responding to this reality?
You're very right. I mean, I think there's a lot of people, particularly with Omicron, who are getting infected for a second or a third time with COVID. And one of the reasons for that is that we know that if you got infected with the first original COVID variant, it doesn't really give you that much protection now, 2 years on, against Omicron. I think the main thing as a government is just not going to make any changes really at all unless the number of patients in intensive care starts to increase again. Because if that happens, then and we start getting a backlog of cases within the NHS, which are really clogging up wards, then the government will come under more pressure. So I think we're just going to have to see over the next few months what happens, whether that changes, and then whether Boris Johnson is forced to do a U-turn.
Right. And David, has there been any more information about the stealth Omicron over there?
Yes, so the latest resurgence, it's thought to be a combination of both the stealth Omicron and also there's a new variant which has literally just started to emerge in the last couple of weeks called Deltacron, which is a combination. It appears that both the Delta and the Omicron variants have combined. So BA2 is a form of Omicron, and it's the form of Omicron which has the most mutations. And so the spikes we're seeing could be because BA2 is more transmissible, a little bit of waning immunity against infections, so people who were last vaccinated in the autumn could have less protection against COVID, and also the relaxed measures mean that BA2 is more easily able to spread from person to person. But the good news that we do have in the UK is because with the vaccine campaign, the boosters do seem to be very effective at preventing hospitalisation. So people who get a booster jab, their chances of getting hospitalised or dying are less than 90%. So I think that is the key thing. That's the reassuring thing. The vaccines do still seem to be able to do their job against BA2.
Right, that is good to know. David, one final question before you go. Here in Korea, there have been severe difficulties in making funeral arrangements given the alarming surge in the number of COVID-19 fatalities. What is the case there in England like? And are people who passed away from COVID-19 allowed to have a traditional burial ceremony?
Yeah, well, we've seen the news about the funerals in South Korea, and I think it's shocked quite a few people. The situation here in the UK is quite different. So I think the good thing is that the death rate is relatively low and it has been under control, even though we've had these rising spikes of cases of Omicron and now BA2. So I think the number of deaths it's from COVID in the UK at the moment is less than 200 a day. So we haven't had funeral services coming under a backlog like 2 years ago. There are still some restrictions. So, for example, if someone is known to have died from COVID-19, then social distancing has to be put in place. There has to be a restriction of the number of people who can come to the funeral. But I think even that might start to end as of April. So the situation with funerals is quite different. And I think people have been quite startled to see the situation in South Korea.
Right, I see. Hopefully our situation will improve in the near future. David, as always, thank you very much for making the time to join us live at this very early hour.
Thank you.
Local health officials say the next week or two will prove to be pivotal in our plight against the pandemic amid the growing presence of the stealth Omicron on the local front. For more, I have Dr. Kim Seung-taek from Institute Pasteur Korea. Dr. Kim, it's good to have you here in the studio.
Good afternoon.
I also have Dr. Alice Hyung-Young-nan at Miss Mary Women's Hospital live on the line. Dr. Dan, welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Right, Dr. Kim, pundits believe stealth Omicron is to blame perhaps for a prolonged fight against this latest wave. Do you agree?
Well, we actually, you guys just talked about stealth Omicron, and then other countries, including the UK, actually, the case numbers actually dropped before the stealth Omicron, but then because of the emergence of stealth Omicron, now the case numbers is increased. So in Korea, somehow now just the Omicron and the stealth Omicron, the surge is kind of just overlap. So maybe the chances are maybe we may have just some extended period of just the peak number of just a case, the total case of just COVID-19. But also there was some, well, we actually just government actually predicted some kind of the peak time, but then since then there was some little bit of changes because all those predictions are based on some calculation of the all different of the variables. But then since then there was some changing of some social distancing guidelines, and in part, and then also this stealth Omicron somehow all just contribute to the maybe just extension of the peak period of the COVID-19.
Right. And Dr. Tan, in the case of a few countries, the Omicron wave began to decline once 20% of the population was infected. Can this criterion be applied here in Korea?
Well, I don't know if every country is following that rule. If we look at what happened in South Africa, for example, they peaked on December 14th when they reached cumulative caseload of 3.2 million cases. They're a country of 60 million people, and so that's roughly 5% of their population. And yet they went down from their peak very steeply. If we want to understand what's going on and what might happen in the future, I think we need to consider what we call the triad, the epidemic triad of virus transmission. So we have to consider what's going on with the virus, the host, and the environment. Here in Korea, we have a very high density in terms of population, but now we have people who are in home care for their care from COVID, convalescence from COVID. And what that means is we now have tens of thousands of children, millions of adults who are convalescing at home. These are infectious people who are at home with other family members. And so in terms of the environment, it's very conducive to having more secondary infections. Also, if we consider what's going on with the virus, of course, we have the rise of the BA2 subvariant. We know it's 30% more transmissible than BA1. It's already claimed dominance in the Gyeongnam region here in Korea, and probably it will become dominant either this week or by the end of next week. And so we have this more transmissible variant that is going to be harder to control. And then also, if we look at the host factors here, we have a very large pool of people who may still be vulnerable to infection. Anyone who's had less than 3 doses of a COVID-19 vaccine should be considered vulnerable to infection. That's about 18.8 million people here. If we subtract the 10 million people who've had recent infection, that's 8.8 million people who are still pretty much wide open to getting infected. So if we take into account the virus factors, the environment factors, and then the host factors, I think what we will see is either a plateau at this high level, or we will go down from the peak, but not in such a steep way as other countries have had.
Right. And Dr. Kim, Korea's Western counterparts are battling stealth Omicron after their initial fight with Omicron. But Korea, for its part, appears to be tackling the two variants simultaneously. What are the implications of this dual challenge, so to speak?
Well, before talking about that, we have to just describe a little bit about just stealth Omicron. That actually Dr. Dan said is BA2. And then one of the big differences compared to the original Omicron, this is a BA1, is the BA2 has 8 mutations, which are not actually observed in the BA1. And then this mutation seems to affect the some more efficient spread of the virus rather than just the causing immune evasion. So then the recent surge in the UK and some other countries seems to be just some combinatory effects. One of this Omicron, this BA2 effect, and also the easing of the social restrictions, and also some waning immunity. And then many people actually experience the some natural infection or just vaccination very earlier before this BA2. So naturally the immune response is just declining. So that's what has happened. And but actually one of the good thing is that this immune response, after the natural infection by the BA1, then this infected and then recovered person has a very good immune status, which is actually just to protect this person from the infection by the BA2, because these two viruses very similar. So then in our country, if the two variants surge simultaneously, maybe we might just experience a little bit a different pattern that we observed compared to that we observed from the UK and other countries.
Right, I see. Dr. Dan, given the events unfolding in the US and in Europe, COVID-19 looks to be a vicious cycle of retreats and rebounds. Having said that, is herd immunity not a feasible option against COVID-19?
Well, you only get herd immunity when you have a constant, unchanging virus, and you also have durable protection from your vaccine. And we have neither in the case of COVID-19 right now. SARS-CoV-2 is a rapidly mutating virus. It keeps on giving us variants that have high transmissibility, that have very strong immune evasion properties. And we also have the problem of waning of immunity from our vaccines. So we have the problem with the virus that's kind of eating away of the immunity that's formed by vaccines and also natural infection. And then we have our vaccines that are becoming less and less protective against new infection. We also have, of course, breakthrough infections that are transmitting disease to others, not as strongly, but that is still going on. And so for the time being, it looks like achieving herd immunity will be very, very difficult until we have a durable vaccine that offers strong cross protection against multiple variants, both present and in the future.
Right, and hopefully we'll have one in the near future then. Dr. Kim, despite the rampant spread of Omicron here in the country's death toll remains relatively low, according to statistics shared by the government on this Friday. How do you explain this finding?
Well, number one reason is that there's some high vaccination rate in Korea. Now, just as we discussed earlier in this program, that now we have just more than 85% of just the full vaccination, I mean, including the full vaccination, and that's the number one reason. And the second reason is now we have not the supply is not really just abundant, but just enough, but then we have now the options for oral drugs, which is now just very efficient, the Paxlovid. And then this Paxlovid is a significant role in just reducing the number of severe COVID-19 patients, subsequently just reducing number of deaths. And then finally, well, this is not really just accurate, but our some very fast diagnosis of the COVID-19 case would just help to the reduce number of deaths, because that actually somehow contribute by expediting prescription of the oral drugs and then the treatment of the patient with the high risk. And then this death rate is kind of the cumulative number, since it's like over just 2 years. But one of the reasons that we actually we have very low fatality rate in Korea is that earlier in pandemic, especially like year 2020, when there was no vaccines available globally, that our country was somehow very successful in that time for the quarantine, the social distancing measures. That time, the way that we can actually prevent the disease progression and then the reducing the death was just heavily dependent on the social distancing guidelines. That actually substantially contributed to reducing number of the total deaths.
I see. Dr. Dan, with regard to those who have sadly lost their lives to COVID-19, authorities have also linked some of those tragic events to pre-existing health conditions. What are your thoughts on that?
I think, of course, underlying chronic medical conditions will place a person at much higher risk for succumbing to COVID-19. But when we look at, what was the death due to COVID-19 itself, what we want to look at is excess deaths per month or per week. And what's clearly the case is that we are seeing far more deaths recently due to Omicron than we would have expected. We know sort of how many people will die from diabetes or heart disease or stroke per week or per month in our country. We have those statistics. But what's going on now is far above and beyond what we would normally expect. And so even though overall the virulence of the Omicron variant is less than that of the Delta strain, when we look at what's going on in terms of the elderly and in people who have high-risk underlying medical conditions, the Omicron strain can still cause severe disease and death. And that's why we've seen during the first, we've seen since February and March, when Omicron was dominant, we've seen more than 7,700 deaths due to COVID-19, whereas, say, for influenza, we would expect in any given year an average of 5,300 deaths due to influenza. So Omicron is very severe, and of course it's very transmissible. So it's infiltrating our long-term care facilities, and that's where all of the high-risk patients are residing, and it's causing huge outbreaks in these facilities, anywhere from 100 to over 400 cases per outbreak per facility. And so this is what's causing and driving many of these deaths.
And Dr. Kim, Korea has recently approved a second antiviral COVID-19 treatment pill, Lagevrio. What has been shared about its efficacy on perhaps the stealth Omicron?
Well, this Lagevrio, this is the brand name, but this generic name is actually molnupiravir, actually developed by the Merck. And this has been actually talked about just a fairly long time, since the last year. And then, well, just regarding this just a specific drug, and this is actually the mechanism of action is very similar to that of the remdesivir. This is basically just inhibiting just virus, just the replication of a genetic material. And then based on the phase 3 clinical trials of this molnupiravir, it was a little bit disappointing because it shows only just 30% of the efficacy compared to the some placebo control. But then the good thing about this drug is that this does not have any drug-drug interaction, and then there's no just the kidney issues, which is actually just a problem with the Paxlovid. In the case of Paxlovid, although the efficacy is very good, it's like 88 or 89% of just efficacy, as long as this drug is taken within the 3 to 5 days after the symptom onset. But then the problem is that, as I told you, there are many just drugs that just showing some drug-drug interaction, and then if there's if any person has some kidney issues, then the person cannot take the Paxlovid. So we need some alternatives, and also considering our just current situation now, just many people are there are so many just confirmed cases, and then supply, especially from Paxlovid, is just limiting. So I think just government somehow, well, this is my just personal thought, somehow just delaying some approval of the molnupiravir, because there was some little concern about the some safety issues. Although this is not, I mean, to me, it's not really substantial, but just in case, I mean, very just careful. But then now just supply is the Paxlovid is limiting, so that this is kind of very just alternative just medication that can be to think about. In terms of drug safety, this is some sort of just a nucleoside analog, which means this is actually mimicking the structure of some building blocks of the virus genetic material. So this can actually incorporate into the virus some genomic just material, so then just actually mess up with the some genetic information of the viruses. This is how this drug actually works. So, but then the maybe potential side effects is this can just cause mutation in our just own genetic material. That's why we actually just this very narrow just some patient groups that actually this drug was actually recommended. But anyway, for the stealth Omicron, just Paxlovid and then remdesivir and then molnupiravir, all just good regardless of just the variant, and because of their just the mechanism of action, they are all good except for the some monoclonal antibodies. So most of the monoclonal antibodies, including our just Korean monoclonal antibody, and then the monoclonal antibody developed by the some foreign countries, mostly are not effective against the Omicron and then the stealth Omicron, except for the bebtelovimab. That's actually just developed by the Eli Lilly recently, and also some Evusheld. That's also some monoclonal cocktails developed by the AstraZeneca.
Right, I see. On the inoculation front, Dr. Tan, reservations for COVID-19 vaccines for children aged 5 to 11 began on Thursday here in the country, as revealed by my colleague Yeon earlier on. But a government survey shows that 6 out of 10 parents are not planning to get their children vaccinated, and 5 out of 10 are actually saying COVID-19 vaccines are more dangerous than COVID-19 infections. How do you respond?
I don't think the numbers support that fear. If we look at a report that was released by the US CDC after 8.7 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine was deployed to children between ages 5 and 11, what they found was there were 100 reports of severe adverse events. There were 3 deaths. One of the deaths occurred in a child who was infected with influenza. And the 2 other deaths happened in children who had very complicated, severe underlying medical conditions. In contrast, in Korea, we've had 2.84 million cases of COVID-19 in children. We've had 11 deaths, among them 9 occurred in children aged 9 and below. And we've also had 16 cases of multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. And so if you look at just what's been going on in terms of the statistics, what happened in the United States among children who actually received the COVID-19 vaccine, and then in terms of the severity, what's been happening here in Korea domestically, the numbers don't really support their fear. And I think that's why in the United States and in many countries around the world, the Pfizer vaccine is recommended for everyone aged 5 years and over.
Right, and going back to the Omicron front, Dr. Kim, what specific countermeasures do you propose to perhaps better prepare for a greater spread of the stealth Omicron here on the local front?
Well, I think compared to the original Omicron BA1, I think we could just maintain the same strategy against this stealth Omicron. There's nothing that we actually just think about. But the one thing that I can actually suggest, and also now I just heard that the government is also just considering the approval of another the treatment option, which is I just talked about the Evusheld, developed by the AstraZeneca. This is a combination of 2 monoclonal antibodies. And then this monoclonal antibody, this cocktail is very special because there are certain people who can get actually just vaccinated, and even after vaccination, they can get the very substantial immune responses. So in those kind of immune compromised people, this Evusheld can be just used as a preventive purpose, not the treatment purpose. Once we actually inject this monoclonal antibodies, then this monoclonal antibody can last for about just 6 months. So, so this is kind of sort of a passive vaccination instead of active vaccination. Active vaccination is that those are what we are doing right now. So we are actually injecting some of the vaccine antigen and then elicit some immune responses. But in this case, immune-compromised person, they cannot elicit those kind of immune responses. So this actually, instead of just eliciting just the immune response, we are actually giving the antibodies just directly to this patient. So this can be something that we can actually just think about right now.
Right. And Dr. Dan, one final question to you. Do you suppose that we need to perhaps reimpose some of our COVID-19 restrictions to deal with a potential surge in stealth Omicron in the country, very briefly speaking?
Right. Well, if we consider this last Monday, based on the risk assessment report, there were more than 500,000 cases who were high risk, age 60 and above, from the last week alone. We have in the provinces, in terms of incidence, it's exceeding hospital capacity by 142%. In the Seoul metropolitan area, hospital capacity relative to incidence, or I should say the other way around, is 91%. There are 5 cities and provinces that have less than 10 ICU beds left for COVID patients. So if you take all this into account, given that we are going to be dealing with a more transmissible BA2 strain, we talk about the virus, the environment, and the host. We have to change either the host or the environment to take care of the increased transmissibility that we will be seeing with the virus. That seems logical to me because hospital capacity is very, very strained right now.
Right, it is. All right, Dr. Dan, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts. I'm also taking note of your show of solidarity with the sufferings of the people over in Ukraine there. Dr. Dan, thank you as always. And Dr. Kim here in the studio, thank you for being with us today. Right, well, that brings us to the end of this week's editions of the Daily Report. Do have a safe weekend and do join us again next week.